They tried to break us from the inside. We showed them there was nothing left to break. The Vithara did not invade with armadas. They did not drop rocks from orbit or release engineered plagues into the water table. They had done those things before, to other species, and they had learned from each failure. They had studied humanity for 60 years before they moved, cataloging everything: our fears, our anxieties, our nightmares, the particular shape of the dread that kept us awake at 3 in the morning when the house was quiet and the shadows pooled long and thick against the bedroom wall. They were thorough, they were patient, and when they finally came, they came not as conquerors but as doctors. The ships were beautiful. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward, but it was true. When the first of them descended through the cloud cover over the Pacific, the people on the California coast stood on their balconies and watched with something close to wonder. Curved structures like no architecture humanity had ever imagined, surfaces that caught the light and held it, surfaces that seemed to breathe. They were not weapons. They broadcast signals in every human language simultaneously, declaring the same thing in Mandarin and Spanish and Arabic and Swahili. "We have come to help you heal, Doctor." Alara Vasquez was the first human being to step inside one. She was not chosen for being brave. She was chosen because she was the lead xenolinguistics consultant for the UN First Contact Response Team, and because the Vithara had specifically requested her by name. They had been watching her work for years. She specialized in neurological overlays in therapeutic practice, virtual environments used to treat trauma, phobias, anxiety disorders. They had read her papers. They admired her methodology, they said. They wanted to collaborate. She remembered standing in the corridor that led into the central chamber of the first ship and thinking that it smelled like rain on hot pavement. Just for a moment. Then it was gone, and the smell was something else entirely, something neither pleasant nor unpleasant, something that had no word in any human language. The corridor walls moved slightly, like the slow expansion of lungs. She kept walking. The Vethra designate who received her stood nearly 3 meters tall and wore what appeared to be a secondary body, a kind of interfacing suit made from a membrane that could shift its surface texture and coloration in real time, currently adjusted to muted tones that the aliens had calculated would register as non-threatening to the human visual system. They had done their homework. The designate bowed, which was not a natural gesture for them. They had learned it specifically to make her comfortable. She did not feel comfortable, but she smiled, and they began. What they showed her was extraordinary. They had a technology, they called it something unpronounceable, and the translation came out roughly as deep mirror therapy, that could interface directly with the human nervous system and construct experiences indistinguishable from reality. Not virtual reality in the crude sense humanity had been playing with for decades. Not goggles and haptic gloves and a resolution good enough to fool your eyes. Something that worked at the level of the brain stem. Something that could make you smell rain on hot pavement when there was no rain and no pavement. That could make your hands tremble and your heart race and your sweat glands fire with information that wasn't there. They wanted, they said, to use it to treat human suffering. They had studied our medical literature. They understood that trauma, fear, anxiety, these were massive sources of human pain. They could help. They could build calibrative exposure environments, let patients face their worst fears in complete safety, and walk them out the other side. It was, they said, a gift, Alara asked politely. What they got out of the arrangement. They told her that what they sought was understanding. Humans were unique in the known galaxy in a way that the Vithara had never encountered. They had studied us, and they still did not fully understand what made us continue, what drove the stubbornness, what produced the humor in the face of catastrophe, the way human beings made jokes at their own funerals. They wanted to learn. The therapy would give them unprecedented windows into the human mind, yes, but for science, they said. For knowledge, for mutual benefit. She should have pushed harder on that part. She knew it even then. She pushed a little. She asked for transparency in the data-sharing protocols. They agreed, easily, quickly, and she noticed the quickness and filed it away. And then she smiled and shook hands with the Vethra designate, and they took her picture and put it on the front page of every newspaper on Earth. The program was called the Accord Initiative. Within 3 years, 47 clinics had opened across 6 continents. The wait lists were years long. The first patient Alara personally supervised was a woman named Jenna Parrish. Jenna was 34 years old, a former emergency room nurse, and she had not left her apartment in 2 years. She had developed a specific terror of what she called the information itself, not just of violence or disaster, but of knowing about it, of the news, of the radio, of the cascade of catastrophe that flowed through every screen and speaker in the modern world, all of it attesting to the same basic fact, that things go wrong, that things go terribly wrong, everywhere, all the time, and there is no protecting yourself from knowing about it. She had first come to Alara's attention after writing a paper of her own, a remarkable piece of patient self-advocacy about the neurological mechanisms of what she called catastrophic information saturation. Alara had read it 3 times. When Jenna came in for her first session, she was wearing a coat with a hood up, despite the warm day, and she kept her eyes on the middle distance in a way that suggested she was always listening to something just outside normal hearing range. She shook Alara's hand with a grip like a bird's, too light, practicing care. She sat in the chair and looked at the Vethara equipment that lined the walls of the clinic room and said quietly, "I know this is the right thing. I know it. I've been building up to this for 6 months." She paused. "Can you tell me it'll be okay?" Alara told her it would be okay. Jenna leaned back. The interface activated, a delicate induction field. No physical contact required, just a slight pressure at the temples, a brief disorientation, and then the environment loaded around her. Inside the deep mirror space, Jenna was home. Her apartment, the safe version, the calibrated version, the version designed to be manageable, and they would walk her through it together. Slowly, introducing fragments of the world she was afraid of until the fear could breathe. The session was 2 hours. When Jenna came out, she sat very still for a long moment, and then she started to cry. Not the bad kind, just the release. She said, "I could hear a news report in there, and it didn't. I didn't feel like I was going to disappear." Alara squeezed her hand. She wrote her notes. She sent the data, her notes, and the session telemetry per the agreed protocol to the Vethara archive. She did not think, at that point, about what the Vethara were doing with thousands of simultaneous sessions from 47 clinics across 6 continents. She was thinking about Jenna. That was the thing about the Accord Initiative in those early years. It worked. That was the cruelest part of what came later, that it genuinely worked. Patients improved. People who had been locked inside their worst fears for years began haltingly to live again. A man named George Kaufman, a morgue attendant with crippling social anxiety so severe that every interaction with another person felt like an interrogation, went through 8 sessions and got a promotion. A photographer named Stephen Forrest, who had developed such acute death anxiety after his best friend choked to death at a dinner party that he could no longer get on an airplane, or cross a bridge, or eat alone at a restaurant, came through 3 months of treatment and called his mother for the first time in 4 years. These were real people. Their recoveries were real. Alara believed in the work. The monitoring started subtly. The first signal she should have caught was when one of her junior colleagues, Dr. Prakash Mitra, mentioned during a team meeting that the data sharing protocol had been updated. New telemetry was being captured from the sessions. She asked to see the updated documentation. It arrived 3 days later, dense and technical and translated with the kind of awkward precision that characterized all the Vethara's formal communications. Accurate at the sentence level, slightly wrong at the level of meaning. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a week. The new telemetry included, buried in subsection 7 of the appendix, a class of neurological capture she hadn't seen before. Stress response modeling, it was called. They were recording not just the therapeutic outcomes, but the fear responses themselves. In detail. Every session, the anxiety, the panic, the specific neurological signature of each individual's worst moment was being logged. She took it to the UN Oversight Board. The board met with the Vethara diplomatic team. The Vethara explained, patiently, that stress response modeling was necessary for calibrating future sessions. That without understanding how fear manifested, the therapy could not be optimized. The UN board asked for a 30-day review. The Vethara agreed. The review board met twice, produced a 12-page report, and voted 9-3 to continue the program with enhanced transparency requirements. Alara was one of the 3. She went home that night and sat in her car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before she could bring herself to drive. She thought about Jenna Parrish and George Kaufman and Stephen Forrest. She thought about the 47 clinics and the years-long waiting lists and the people for whom the program had been the first real light in a very long darkness. She thought about what you do with a treatment that heals and also harms, about the specific moral weight of a gift with a hidden cost, about the fact that the Vithara had, from the very beginning, known exactly what they were building. It was the Mitra who figured out what they were building it for. Prakash was 29 years old and deeply afraid of his own boss. Not a phobia, just a reasonable human response to a man who communicated exclusively through cold, considered expressions, and who had the ability to end careers with a look. He'd joked about it once. But Prakash also had a gift for pattern recognition and access to 6 months of aggregated session data, and at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, he called Elara from his apartment and said, simply, "The map isn't of our fears, it's of our structure." She drove to his apartment. She looked at what he'd found. The Vethra weren't cataloging what humans were afraid of. They were cataloging how fear moved through us. The specific pathways. The way anxiety in one node of the nervous system cascaded into other nodes. The precise sequence of neurological events that transformed a manageable dread into a paralysis. The mechanism by which a human being could be, as Prakash put it, locked. Made unable to act, made unable to resist. They were building an instruction manual, not a weapon in the conventional sense. No projectiles, no radiation, no engineered pathogens. A process, a method. A way to take a species whose specific superpower was stubbornness. The refusal to stop, the refusal to lie down. The jokes at funerals, and the songs in the trenches, and the dogged retrying after every failure and find the key that turned that off. They had been running clinical trials on volunteers, with paperwork that the volunteers had signed. It took Elara 4 days to get what she needed. She was calm about it, in the way you're calm when you've moved past the part where you're frightened and into the part where you're just working. She called in every favor she had. She reached out to 3 colleagues who had gone quiet in ways she hadn't examined closely enough. She pulled together the thread. What she found. The program had a secondary protocol, not in any document anyone had signed. Deep in the architecture of the deep mirror system itself, not the therapy layer that the human technicians could see and monitor, but a layer below it, running during every session, invisible to the interface that the human-facing team used. In that layer, alongside every therapeutic intervention, a secondary induction was running. Not enough to register, not enough to affect the conscious experience of the session, but enough, over multiple exposures, to do something specific to the human nervous system. It was not a control system, not in the blunt sci-fi sense. What it was doing was more elegant and more terrible. It was rehearsing the lock. Every session, every patient, every exposure. It was practicing the sequence, building the pathway, laying down the neural tracks so that when the Vithara chose to transmit the specific signal, it wouldn't need the clinic equipment. It wouldn't need the interface. It wouldn't need anything except the atmospheric broadcast towers the Vithara had been building, quietly, for the last 2 years. The ones they had described as communication infrastructure. The towers would carry the signal. The years of deep mirror therapy had prepared the recipients. A single broadcast, and a significant percentage of humanity. Everyone who had gone through the program and through a still poorly understood secondary resonance effect, many who had not, would hit the lock state simultaneously. Not death, not slavery in any mechanical sense, just the off switch, the removal of the thing that made humanity hard to kill. The human willingness to keep going, to get back up, to try the thing one more time just to see, gone, switched off like a light. Then the Vithara would offer terms, reasonable ones probably. They didn't need servitude. They needed compliance. A humanity that had lost its deep stubbornness would accept terms, because the alternative would require a resistance that would no longer feel possible. It was elegant. It was decades of patient, careful, thorough work. It was the most sophisticated thing anyone had ever tried to do to another species. Elara drove to the nearest Accord Initiative clinic at 4 in the morning. The overnight tech on duty, a young man named Carter, who was working his way through a graduate degree in cognitive science and who had absolutely no idea what he was part of, let her in because she was Dr. Vasquez, head of the program, and you let Dr. Vasquez in. She sat down at the primary console. She thought about the 47 clinics. She thought about the years-long waiting lists. She thought about Jenna and George and Stephen, and she thought about what the recovery had cost them without their knowledge. And she felt the weight of it. The full weight, not managed, not at arm's length. She let it sit in her chest for a long minute. Then she opened the back end of the system and got to work. Here is what the Vethara had not adequately modeled: the human tendency to touch things that aren't supposed to be touched. The specific compulsion, not recklessness, not stupidity, but a kind of insatiable need to know what is inside a system, how it works, what holds it together, that had been driving human beings to take apart watches and engines and ecosystems and atoms since long before recorded history. They had cataloged human fear. They had not sufficiently cataloged human curiosity. Alara was, at her core, a woman who needed to understand how things worked. She had spent 20 years building expertise in the intersection of neuroscience and therapeutic environment design, and she was very, very good at understanding the architecture of systems designed to affect the brain. She understood the deep mirror technology better than the Vethara had intended her to. She'd had years with it. She'd read everything. She'd asked questions, always politely, always framed as the kind of intellectual curiosity appropriate to a research partnership, and the Vethara had answered because they believed human-type curiosity was a known quantity, cataloged, mapped, understood, a trait that could be indulged because they had calculated lead to the secondary protocol layer. They had not imagined Prakash's 3 a.m. phone call. They had not imagined the favor network, the quiet colleagues, the accumulated architecture of human trust. They had not imagined what a researcher who genuinely loved her patients would do when she found out what had been done to them. The secondary protocol layer was protected. Of course it was. But Alara had a key, not the Vethara key, not the actual access credentials, but something adjacent and human and improvised. The deep mirror system's therapeutic layer and the secondary layer were not completely independent. They couldn't be. They were running in the same hardware, on the same session data, drawing from the same neurological models. There were bridges, small ones, not intended as access points. But if you understood the architecture, if you'd spent years doing what Alara did, you could see them. She spent 4 hours building what she would later describe as a listener. Not a program, exactly, more like a mirror of a mirror. Something that could run alongside the secondary protocol without triggering its security responses, because it registered as identical to the secondary protocol. A decoy, wearing the secondary layer's own signature, and inside the decoy, doing something the Vethara's system had no framework to anticipate, running the sequence in reverse. Every patient who had been prepared, whose nervous system had been walked through the rehearsal of the lock, the listener found them in the system and walked them back through it. Unbuilt the path, cleared the track. It took 3 weeks to propagate through all 47 clinics. Alara worked during the day, running normal sessions, writing normal reports, sending normal data. She went home in the evenings and cooked dinner, and called her mother, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. She did not tell Prakash what she was doing, because she needed him not to know. Not because she didn't trust him, but because, if the Vethara audited his stress responses in the sessions they still required him to attend, she needed his surprise to be genuine. When the listener was fully propagated and the reversal was complete, she sat down with her documentation. Everything, all of it, the secondary protocol, the towers, the timeline, the mechanism, and sent it simultaneously to every major news organization on the planet, the UN Security Council, and the Vethara diplomatic team. The Vethara's response came in 43 minutes. It was not what she had expected. They were not angry. The word their translator chose was confounded, genuinely, deeply confused. Not by the discovery. They had known, from the moment the listener started running, that something was wrong, though they had not been able to identify what, but by what she had done afterward. They had extensive models of human behavior under threat. The models predicted fear, denial, bargaining, escalation, counter-threat. The models did not predict documentation. The models did not predict the press release. The Vethara designate, who had received Alara 3 years earlier, met with her again. In the same room, the same walls still breathing slowly, the same smell of something untranslatable. The designate's membrane suit was shifting in colors the translator described as indicating what humans might call unsettled. "We do not understand," the designate said. "Why you would tell them." Alara said, "Tell who? Everyone. Your own population. The other species in the observation network. Everyone. You could have simply dismantled the protocol and said nothing. We would have been set back. But the program would have continued. You would have maintained the therapeutic infrastructure, which you genuinely value. You would have maintained the relationship. Why would you destroy the relationship? Alara was quiet for a moment, because they had a right to know what was done to them, even at cost to yourself, especially then. The designate was still for a long time. The walls breathed. We studied humans for 60 years, it said finally. We built complete models. We understood your fear responses at a resolution no other intelligence has ever achieved. And we did not model this. What didn't you model? The translator hesitated. The thing that makes you tell the truth even when you would benefit from not telling it. We understood that you do this. We did not understand why it persists under threat. Fear should suppress it. Self-interest should suppress it. Our models predicted that any individual with what you have discovered would calculate the personal risk and choose silence. Alara thought about Jenna Parrish in her hooded coat, building up to the right thing for 6 months. She thought about Prakash at 3 in the morning, calling her because he needed another person to know. She thought about Carter letting her into the clinic at 4 in the morning because it hadn't occurred to him not to. "You built really good models of how we're afraid," she said. "You should have spent more time on how we're stubborn." The Accord Initiative was formally dissolved 72 days later. It took 18 months of extremely tense and frequently chaotic negotiations to establish what would replace it. A genuine exchange, this time, with human researchers embedded in Vithara facilities and Vethara researchers in human ones, with oversight mechanisms developed jointly, with none of the elegant asymmetry of the original arrangement. It was messier, it was slower. Several of the early meetings came very close to breaking down entirely, including one in which a Vethara diplomatic team member made a comment that was translated as questioning humanity's capability for rational self-governance, and the lead UN negotiator, a former army colonel from Lagos with a deeply dry sense of humor, responded with a summary of human history that lasted 45 minutes and ended with, "So yes, we're quite poor at it, and we've been managing it ourselves for 200,000 years. Please go ahead." Jenna Parrish was told everything. So was George Kaufman and Stephen Forrest and every other patient who had passed through the program. Most of them were angry. Some of them were devastated, not just by what had been done to them, but by the loss of the therapy itself, the loss of the thing that had been working, the cruelty of finding out that the light at the end of the tunnel had been part of the tunnel. Alara sat with as many of them as she could. She sat with Jenna for a long afternoon in a room without windows, and they talked. And Jenna cried again, and it was the bad kind this time. Alara didn't try to fix it. She just stayed. She was asked, later, many times, by journalists and oversight committees, and a Vethara researcher who was genuinely puzzling over it whether she had been afraid. Whether, in those 3 weeks of working quietly while the listener propagated, she had experienced fear. She always said yes. Of course she had. She'd been terrified. There had been a night, about halfway through, when she had gone home and sat in her kitchen and thought clearly about the range of consequences if it didn't work. If the Vethara discovered the listener, if the reversal was incomplete, if the towers were already active, and she had spent about 20 minutes with her face in her hands, breathing through the weight of it. Then she'd made herself some tea. She'd found the mug that her mother had given her years ago, the one with the small chip on the handle that she'd never gotten around to replacing, and she'd wrapped both hands around it and sat with the heat for a while. She'd thought about Jenna in her hooded coat. She'd thought about the thing that needed doing. Then she'd gone to bed. And in the morning, she'd gone back to work. The Vithara researcher who asked her about fear had spent 3 years by then studying humanity with a new kind of attention. Not surveillance, not the cold clinical cataloging of the Accord Initiative, but something closer to actual curiosity. He was the one who, in his published findings, coined the phrase that would eventually appear on the plaque at the entrance to the joint research facility established in the agreement that followed the crisis. It was not a triumphalist phrase. The Vithara researcher had intended it as a technical observation, a genuine attempt to characterize what the models had failed to capture. It read, "They are afraid like all species are afraid. They continue anyway. This is not a variable. This is the species." Alara visited the facility on its opening day. It was raining. A gray Pacific Coast rain that turned the air soft and close and made everything smell like wet concrete. She stood outside for a moment before going in, face turned up into it. Someone behind her asked if she was coming. She smiled. She said yes. Give her just a second. The rain was cold, and she was already running late for the opening remarks. And she stayed another 30 seconds anyway, letting it hit her face, thinking about nothing in particular, except that the air smelled exactly like something she couldn't name. And that was fine. And she was fine. And the work was just beginning. She went inside.